Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. And this is probably going to be one of the most insane episodes we've done in a while, and that's saying something considering the entire year of 2020. It's sort of the culmination of everything we've talked about on an individual level, whether it be tensions in the Middle East, the global pandemic, the crash in oil prices, the state enforcement of global homosexuality, all mixed into one pot, creating this glorious episode. We got quite
It's an
a
extra special episode.
thank you. But yeah, we have quite a mountain to climb ahead of us, so might as well start with square one, where we usually do in Syria. And Syria, in and of itself, we'll probably spend another half hour talking about, like we did last week. Now, where to start in Syria? I think the most appropriate place is Israeli airstrikes on allegedly Iranian backed targets in Homs. You can see that in center Syria with the blue bomb icon next to the red skull icon. Of course, we'll get into some of the stuff about the Iranian satellites and the IRGC later, but tensions are picking up on that front. There were some clashes that saw some Syrian forces and Syrian government forces dead near the Syrian Jordanian border, right on the border with the occupied Golan Heights as well. Uh, the opposition forces apparently got into some hot water on the Syrian Lebanese border. Joint Russian Turkish patrols in Idlib. For once, Idlib is actually the calm part of Syria. I never thought I'd come to that again. Uh, in eastern Syria, near Deir ez-Zor, of course, near all the oil fields, there's been quite a dust up. ISIS has made a resurgence. Now, on the Iraqi side of the border, I believe they killed 11 Iraqi troops. There were a Syrian government arrest of members of a group that called themselves Syrian Hezbollah. Now, for context, Hezbollah is just the word for Party of God in Arabic, so not necessarily affiliated with the Lebanese Hezbollah or even the Iraqi Hezbollah. I imagine it's probably some like Sunni terrorist group that's just trying to co-opt the name. That'd be my guess. Now, correct me if I'm wrong on that front. Uh, and possibly the most interesting events are in northeastern Syria. One of the SDF groups. I actually don't. I'm not sure whether they were a Kurdish group or just an SDF group in general, but point being is they were on joint patrols of the Syrian government, and it devolved into a bit of fighting. Of course, U.S. patrols have been turned around again by the pelting of rocks, and yeah, Syria is completely insane. But I think the most significant story out of all this is the resurgence of ISIS, something we haven't seen in a while. Very coincidental timing, if you ask me. Maybe I'm being a conspiracy theorist here. But all these other things don't seem out of the ordinary. But ISIS, out of nowhere all of a sudden, after, what, a year and a half after they've been totally defeated, as Trump said, resurging,
Yeah,
I'm sure that's completely organic. People are just, like, revved up by ISIS propaganda. No foreign backing, no foreign agitation, nothing of the sort. You can't convince me otherwise.
yeah, and of course, last week there was a capture of vehicles that were filled with American rifles, American munitions, American launchers. I don't know. Who knows where they got them from? And
Clearly
it's
rogue
also,
elements that smuggled them. Clearly rogue Russian elements in collusion with
I mean,
Trump.
yeah, I mean, although ISIS like literally can strike just about anywhere in Syria, the majority of the attacks are happening in eastern Syria and western Iraq. So I'm suspecting not that they're all going to use that one road that connects the two countries that America has control over, but rather, I would assume the border in that, because it's a very desertified area, uh, has all kinds of routes, and they would probably try not to venture and become targets too much. So I find it interesting that that's where the most amount of ISIS attacks have been occurring in the last 2 weeks is eastern Syria and western Iraq. It's interesting because it makes kind of makes America the indispensable country again. Um, Funny how that happens. It becomes dispensable and outright unwanted. Of course, the Iraqis called the American soldiers Jews. That's a euphemism.
Oh no,
I
we're
kid
gonna have
you
to go to
not.
the ADL with that one. That's unacceptable.
I kid you not. They literally call them Jews. And so, suddenly when America is unwanted and they're closing down their bases, there's a resurgence of ISIS.
Surely just a coincidence. Like I said,
Yeah.
it's ISIS propaganda. It's because Trump hasn't been hard enough on ISIS, and this just justifies what Bill Kristol was saying. And we just need to fight him over there, which is why we need to keep troops in Syria, and we need to fight the Iranian-backed ISIS forces that Trump hasn't been hard enough on. Am I doing a good job? Where's my
Yeah.
Fox News slot yet? I'm ready to replace Tucker Carlson. That's what this entire show has been an audition for. Complete op research. You've all been fooled. But
Yeah. Liberate Michigan, liberate Iraq, liberate Syria.
liberate Tehran. We'll be celebrating in Tehran next year, John Bolton said 2 years ago. Oh, John Bolton, I haven't seen that slime ball in a while. Not that it's a bad thing, but yeah, in all seriousness, yeah, there's something afoot. I'm not going to say it for sure. I'm not going to go into conspiracy theorist territory, but be skeptical. That's all I have to say.
Yeah.
Of course, the like I said, Idlib has been the big surprise out of all of this, considering the fact I'm sure I was almost certain Assad would have used the coronavirus as a chemical weapon at this point, and he would have done it to root out the innocent freedom fighters working so hard to protect their Jeffersonian democracy in northeastern Syria, of course, with the backing of Turkey and the United States and Saudi Arabia. I would have been almost certain, but it seems like he's biding his time and he's going to unleash it at a later date. Unlike those chemical weapons which he unleashed, which everyone's soon forgot about, just because the Western media does not care about Syria, as we're so often told. And uh, but in all seriousness, yeah, Idlib has been very calm. It seems like Russia and Turkey have somewhat come to an agreement, which was surprised. It's actually a bit of a 180 from the past 2 weeks where we were expecting things to really flare up. Now, look, I don't think Idlib is down for the count, but it seems temporarily with everything else going on, especially these oil wars, which again we'll get into, that Idlib has sort of become a final concern in the minds of at least the Western powers, and the focus, at least for Syria, is on northeastern Syria, near all those oil fields, which, from what I've been told, oil is worthless this whole time. But it's as if we weren't doing it for the money, but to specifically deny them their fuel source for their war machine. Again, that's just another conspiracy theory, but it turns out, yeah, the attention in Syria has been shifted even more eastward than it already has been, and I would say expect more of these ISIS attacks. Expect more to be happening near the Deir Zor area, near the Iraqi border. And
Yeah.
yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if. I mean, I believe that's where the Iranian convoys come in. If Iranian convoys just start hitting IEDs, it's. Yeah, especially with some things going on now, I expect things to ratchet up, which I think that will be our cue to go into Iran. Now, interesting things have been happening with Iran. Ever since Trump and the Iranian government took the quote unquote off ramp back in January to de escalate tensions, things have been relatively quiet. There's been the normal diplomatic back and forth, the uh, war of wor- uh, war of words, if you will. But this came out of nowhere. Apparently, Trump gave the U.S. Navy free range to engage any Iranian ships that are harassing them. Now, of course, longtime viewers of the show will remember during the spring and summer of last year, around this time last year, sort of the oil tanker hijackings and the sabotage of oil tankers and the back and forth between the United States and Iran and other Western powers and other powers in the region, where it would just be stopping these ships, raiding these ships, whatever. Probably one of the closest events that sparked a war between the U.S. and Iran. But now it looks like They're going full force, no problem. Engage a ship if you think it's threatening you. And I do think this is very odd considering everything that happened. Now, like I said, we'll get into the oil thing in a couple minutes. I just got to keep hyping that up. But one of my predictions on the show and off the show, I said that if oil drops any further, the United States was going to have to resort to more overt means of enforcing its power. And it looks like that's where we are now because as economic power declines because of a global tanking of the economy, if you will, we have to resort to purely hard power to enforce our will. We've seen this time and time again. Uh, we saw more aggression during the Bush years for that reason, especially towards the tail end of that as the economy really started to slow down. You could argue under Obama's early years, especially with a lot of the drone war stuff, you saw that. Much more subtle hard power, which may sound like a contradiction, but I think you guys get the point. But yeah, the weak oil goes not only to zero, but in the negatives where look, take this oil, we'll pay you to take it. That's how worthless of a commodity it has become. The US decides to pull no punches with the Iranians. And of course this also coincides with the IRGC launching their first military satellite, which will definitely be a game changer, especially in Syria. Uh,
Yeah.
that'll give them their own intelligence. They've been relying on, of course, outside powers for intelligence, whether that be China or Russia or wherever else, or what they could steal from the United States to the West. But it looks like they now, at least, as it may be a crude satellite from, it's decades out of date, but they have something. And funny enough, just for the juvenile humor I must get in here, I believe it was the 420th military satellite launched this week, no less.
Yeah, I mean it's a momentous time for Iran, and I guess they're celebrating it by attacking American military ships in the Persian Gulf. Um, yeah, I mean they're struggling through COVID like anybody else, but ultimately they have a population that's used to living under far more adversity uh, than what Americans have been used to, or just about any other Western country. So, and in a sense, they're also fighting a proxy war in Syria and in Yemen, and they're doing or their proxy forces are doing very well in Yemen. Ansar Allah has already taken more ground from the Saudi-backed forces last week. So yeah, they're definitely being more assertive. I think they know that. I mean, essentially, what America wants is to change the country in an absolutely radical way, in a way that we probably wouldn't even recognize Iran, and that's just it's not up for bids.
Yeah,
And
it wouldn't even be the days of the Shah where some puppet dictator's in power. It would be probably an Iraq style thing where look, Iran has a lot more diversity than you would realize. It's not just Persians. There's Kurds. There's I believe they call them Balokis. There's all these different groups. There's Arabs in
yeah,
Khuzestan. They would fracture Iran the same way they did Iraq, except there's a lot more to fracture in Iran.
right, and I mean, it's I guess a testament to their state power, but also to their people to not fracture. That I mean, America has been trying to fracture them for nigh 40 years.
Yeah, just for context,
And
during Saddam's war, he expected Khuzestan full of Sunni Arabs to side with the invading Iraqi forces, and they did not.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, obviously, it's not working. They've tried to solve this puzzle many times and with different ways, and they haven't succeeded. And if you ask me, I mean, Iran has more clout and more power now than it did 10 years ago, easily. Hence why America and Israel are so worried, not to mention Saudi Arabia. Um, And maybe that's just it. It's it feels like it's a fight to the death, especially in the way that the war in Syria is kind of emblematic of that. That the outcome in Syria is going to determine a lot of what happens in the next 10 years for all the players inside Syria. I mean, should the West and the jihadis in Israel win in Syria, you would see a kind of a rapid decline of Iranian power and Russian power. No doubt. America would reinsert itself. I don't know how much American power would grow, because ultimately it still depends on America being able to negotiate and work with whatever polity that they're using for their geopolitical strategies long term. But and it's hard to imagine that this war is nearly 10 years old, and it could be one of those wars that will drag on for at least another 5 years. I thought, like, maybe in 2018 there was a possibility that it could be all finished with, and I think there was that hope again this year in February. But the truth is, every time that a truce is called, in a way it empowers the American side and the jihadi side and the Israeli side and so on. And now they never retake what they've lost, but in a sense they don't have to, because of the power that is America as a partner. That can come back very quickly should Syria and Russia cry uncle, as it were. So I think that a lot of what's happening in Iraq with regards to Iran is still linked with what is happening in Syria. And but again, you don't see Iran backing off. In a way, it knows that it's calling America's bluff, and to a great extent, even the carrier fleets now, there's talks of reducing them, of not making as many. The truth is, carriers kind of are useful for like colonies that have to be disciplined, right?
Yeah, it's
But
good
with
for
the
intervention in Somalia or whatever. But I mean, going up against even Iran, which, look, we can talk about Russia and China with the new generation of missiles that have pretty much made the carrier obsolete in a war against them. But even a second-rate power such as Iran, with their barrage of outdated missiles, we saw this in what was it, 2002, 2003, with the Millennium Challenge, where they sunk the entire Fifth Fleet in one day.
Right, and hypersonic missiles are better now 17 years later than they were then. They don't need, like, I think, some kind of extraordinary machinery to like launch one of these things. And this is why they're using this swarm approach, where you can't possibly knock out all the boats. Some of the boats are going to launch their missiles, and you're going to have a gigantic carrier that's going to go down with thousands, not with 3 or 4 guys on board, and a lot of expensive craft. So I think they know that in a way there's escalating there isn't, because where are they going to go after this? After this, they will have to depend on air superiority, which they have easily. So they'll have to use their forces and their sites in Bahrain and Incirlik. I'm guessing this time Turkey will allow them to use Incirlik, or they can draw out their carriers further into the Indian Ocean. Their sorties would be compromised, and they would have fewer of them, and they wouldn't be able to say approach Iran. The target is leisurely, because they'd be a greater distance away. They'd have to think about fuel and so on. But it would be possible. So I guess in a way, Iran is basically teasing that out of them. Like, I think Iran knows that the next round of hostilities, if America's pushed hard, will have to be kind of like an air dominance engagement. And I guess Iran also feels just the way they feel about the carriers, that they're not really going to retaliate.
Yeah, and you want to talk about an air engagement? I mean, naval engagement's out of the question, like we just went over. I mean, the Iranians have their own jerry-rigged S-300s, and just going on what we've seen in Syria with S-200s up against American military equipment, not a good day. Now, American operators of these equipment are probably more competent than the Israeli ones, at least I would think so. Uh, but, yeah. I mean, and what, how many times does Syria use their proper S-300s? I don't think that many times. I think the bulk of their air defense are still S-200. So, look.
Yeah, that.
Go on.
Yeah, that and the Buk system, which is even older.
Yeah, like these are things, I think like the first iteration of the S-200s were 1967. So old Soviet equipment is what we're getting at. But with the entire Iran thing, and it has been an uphill battle, an uphill hypothetical battle since the 2000s. And as time goes on, the American military gets stretched more and more thin. Now, I'm not saying the American empire is collapsing or on the brink of collapse or anything, but I'm saying it's becoming harder for it to maintain a grip on these unruly countries, as it were. And and as time goes on, as Iran is able to hold its own more and more, the more and more tensions ratchet up. And look, I was expecting this year, before the virus outbreak, that it would be a tit-for-tat conflict between the U.S. and Iran throughout the year, but neither side wanted to fully escalate for internal political reasons. And it looks like, again, because of the entire world getting turned on its head by this thing, that went out the window. But maybe as things calm down at least a little bit, this might start picking back up. I mean, for the obvious geopolitical reasons, for internal political reasons, the Iranian government, they've had one of the worst outbreaks of the virus. Oil prices have tanked now. Similar case in the U.S. I wouldn't say we're obviously not as bad off as Iran in either of those aspects. Well, the virus, it's a wait and see thing, but better healthcare infrastructure, whatever. We can get into that later, whatever.
Well, I mean, it's put, I think, one or two carriers out of commission. At least one carrier in some battleships are out of commission right now.
Yeah.
Because of the virus. But yeah, I mean, the kind of reserves that America has.
But as summer, fall rolls around, especially the U.S. presidential election, this is going to be a great opportunity for the American leadership and the Iranian leadership to pull a sort of rally around the flag campaign where Trump is. I am the only candidate who can stand strong in the face of the threats we face in the Middle East, and with our response to this invisible enemy, as he's labeled it, which I think is funny for many reasons. Which, again, I'm not going to get into that right now. But Trump can do the rally around the flag thing, the wartime president, in multiple regards, and the Iranians can whip their populations back into shape after some discontent with the government. And again, it's a time of national unity in countries all across the world, but especially for these two whose horns are completely locked. I have a feeling we're going to see tensions escalate on both sides. And I thought Syria would be an impetus for this. Apparently not. Maybe Yemen, but I think, again, the battleground, especially with the oil thing, which makes this even more ironic, I think the battleground we're going to see this play out in is Iraq.
Yeah. I mean, it's also the safest place to do it. It's where there's the greatest amount of American presence. It's where arguably they could draw up the greatest amount of support. in a way, although it's between two fronts, it's essentially a territory they can never leave. So yeah, and America can never leave Iraq.
Yeah, and the ethnic and religious lines are drawn just perfectly, actually, for both sides of the conflict. The Iranians can play on the Shia majority, while the Americans can buy the support of the Sunni Arabs and the Kurds.
Yes, there's that. Although I don't think the Americans have as much support for the Sunni factions in Iraq as the Shia do, and I think there's even some Sunni support of the Shias in Iraq.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. But I think we could.
because of the sense of being invaded by the U.S.
Yeah, I think that's true for now. But I think if things escalate, if the Shia factions in Iran overplay their hand, as it were, and start like acting repressive, which again is completely within the cards, they could see like, oh, we don't like the Americans, but they're better than those I like infidels, or what do they call like the ones who are the other religion, the ones who are the other, like, again, the Islamic terms they use to denounce each other. But point being is, that very well could be in the cards. Now I think the Iranians probably have a bit more tact, considering how much support they've garnered in Syria across both ethnic and religious lines. So, but again, anything's possible. Wars, especially fourth generation wars, can become very messy in a very short amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah, and it makes me think though, how profitable will it be for Trump? And this is also why Iran is sort of teasing and harassing the U.S. Like, how profitable would it be for him to escalate things with Iran in Iraq? I mean, I could see how that could take the focus off of COVID-19, because, of course, the media is obsessed with Trump is killing us. Not that he's doing a great job, he's not, but, like, I mean, there are people hysterical, on Twitter and whatnot. Trump is literally killing us, and so I'm wondering how profitable it will be. I could imagine Biden saying during the debates, that is, if we are going to have debates or even have an election.
oh, don't tease me like that.
I mean, you could well imagine Biden saying, well, we had a great deal, and so, yeah, we have a great deal. It was working. It didn't have to be this way. You could imagine the arguing. Netanyahu at this time is sharing the government, as it were, because after 3 election cycles, like, they're unable to decide who is actually the leader of Israel. Gantz might have, like, the ability to sway opinion in a different direction. So I think, I wonder about just how much of a benefit would it be. Of course, Trump could gain, and he wouldn't be the first president who would gain from going to war with another country or escalating the situation with Iran in particular. However, the election is in the fall, the very late fall, and if there's a resurgence of COVID and a war, not unlike Woodrow Wilson's time.
No.
But I think this is a vastly different America 100 years later. And I think it's not an America that is going to tolerate it. So I wonder, what kind of retaliation we're going to see. Let's not forget, 3 or 4 bases in Iraq have been closed. Like I say, they can't leave, but at the same time, they can't spread out either. It was a tactical move it was a tactical retreat, you could say, bolster your presence in the embassy in Baghdad and let go of the non-essential parts. But then that would also strengthen Iran's position with respect to Syria.
Yeah, I think the biggest issue actually right now when it comes to American policy in the Middle East, beyond my own personal opinion of the question, why the hell are we there, but just looking at it from a purely pragmatic standpoint, from somebody who would support it, is the lack of a strong partner. Now, whether that would be the UK or France or any Western European power, or even another power in the region, such as Saudi Arabia or one of the more wealthy Gulf states, or I know that never happened, but Israel. You need a smaller, less powerful country that can sort of shore up where your weaknesses are. And traditionally, that's been the UK, to a lesser degree, France, but that is absent right now. I mean, especially considering the fact since the UK just completely bailed on Iraq, what, a month ago?
Mm. Yeah, exactly. On paper, it might seem all possible, but the truth is, if you put it into a historical context, they've already been there for nearly 20 years. So, if the first Iraq war hadn't happened, yeah, maybe. But, they've been there since 2003. So,
Yeah, it's when you consider all other factors, it quickly crumbles, and especially this year alone, and that's not even considering the past 17 years, or just going back to the first Gulf War, even. I mean, just the American involvement specifically in that part of that region of the world, and yeah, we've exhausted all options, and the only thing we could do that would honestly secure it is all-out war, which we've gone over many times. Why that would be impossibility, whether that be the engagement of Iran or the quote-unquote rebuilding of Iraq. It's again, it's I don't envy anyone in this situation. Is all I'll say about that.
Plus, I think an all-out war, America without significant help from its Western partners would ultimately mean a very different kind of circumstance evolving in Syria. I mean, I think what we're looking at is America doing its level best to try to contain two situations in two different countries, although bordering each other with slightly different dynamics going on. There is overlap, of course, with respect to ISIS and Kurds and so on. Also, both have interests that involve the Saudis and the Israelis. But I think what you're seeing is, the level best. Saudi Arabia isn't going to get involved. Saudi Arabia can't even handle Yemen. The other Arab states are also not. I mean, of the Arabian Peninsula, so United Arab Emirates, Qatar, so on. They're not involving themselves anymore than they have to. This is very different rhetoric coming out than late 2015, when it looked like that Saudi Arabia was going to, along with other Arab partners, was ready to invade Syria. And that just never materialized. And its conflict with Yemen now is even more embroiled. They're doing even worse. Who would have thought from 5 years ago that its oil fields or, and other important, like, civilian sites would be targeted by Houthis? So it's a very, it's a very different conflict than even than when it was in 2015. Definitely, the stakes have been ratcheted, and the kind of power that the sort of Sunni American Israeli side had enjoyed 5 years ago is not there, and so it'll be very interesting to see what kind of peace, if there's going to be peace, that we sued for, but. In other episodes, I've said that I don't think they will. It would be an enormous humiliation. You would see other countries with completely different interests and topics, whether it were trade or, let's say, any number of things. you would see other countries basically challenge American authority in very different ways, in very different localities than the Middle East, or strictly about, let's say, oil and securing of trade routes. There would be a panic, I think, that would set in, especially all the client states that depend on America very heavily for their own sort of burgeoning nationalism.
Oh yeah, I could name a few, but I'm not going to. But
Yeah.
with that, we'll get into the oil wars, because the situation you just described with America suing for a humiliating peace and giving up much of its international credibility, I'm under no illusion that the American empire is in decline or on the brink of collapse, as I said earlier. But if there is a time that any rival of the United States, that anyone who wants to end this current global system wanted to act, it should be now. There's no better opportunity to crush the current global order than it is right now. You can go straight for the throat and end it all. Now, I'm not saying it'd be that easy, easier said than done as always. But if there would be a concerted effort by, again, the usual suspects, this could be a chance to drive us into a truly multipolar world. And it seems like that may be happening now. We hyped the oil wars for the first half hour of this episode, and we're finally now getting into it. And just as a briefing, on Monday, the global oil prices not only dropped to zero, but they dropped to the negatives. I believe it's currently sitting around negative 37. It's stabilized around there, which, I mean, as much as you can call that a stabilization, where they're paying people to take the oil. Now that's on top of the past month of oil disputes and alleged deals and the implosion of prices. And then the cherry on top, American shale was suffering already. This has probably killed it, because before it probably would have killed the upstarts had them integrated into the larger corporations. But it seems like the larger corporations are also going to take their hits. Now, this isn't the death of the American oil industry as a whole, but the shale industry, which is, I don't think most, but definitely a significant part of it, definitely enough where it's going to, I would say, tank the American economy. Not that we weren't already heading that direction. Yeah, that's been done just by the short amount of time oil has been this much in free fall, and most professionals, quote unquote, say it's going to get worse. Most amateurs on our side think it's going to get worse, and I think we have not seen the end of this. Far from.
Yeah, and you can see how this has affected even the storage of oil. Last week, we were talking about how all the countries basically involved in OPEC Plus, which was created in 2016, not only were going to stabilize the price at a relatively low price, but that they were also going to cut production, and it would be like a rolling out. So in May, I believe they're due to cut production by at least 10%. Some states were expected to cut more than others, but it's a ballpark figure. Except the U.S. The U.S. figured that its loss in revenues of such staggering low oil prices would mean it shouldn't have to cut. As if, like, all the other countries aren't suffering because of low oil prices. And so I think it's ironic that, yesterday, that, essentially the oil hub Cushing is virtually full. So there's, I believe, 3 different locales. So one of them is in Oklahoma, and that one is 70% full. So you're thinking, well, what about the 30%? Well, that's already spoken for. And then there's another reserve in Texas and Louisiana, and they hold about 635 million barrels. They can accommodate another 77 million barrels, but that's it. So now there's a motion for Congress to pass a bill where the U.S. government will buy the oil, especially of the 1,000 or so small shale oil producers. But I imagine other producers as well, or there will be a problem. And the important thing about these oil storage hubs, as it were, in the U.S., is that West Texas Intermediate is like, it uses them as a kind of way of pricing the oil. So all these smaller oil distributors and oil traders look at them for setting the price. And this accounts for about 13% of total U.S. oil storage is in these three locales. So, of course, they're dispersed. There's other locales, but these are easily the three biggest. And Cushing is the biggest partner that there is. So they're in a definite bind. The price of oil is, has basically just caved out. And in a way, you go to the gas station and you wonder why. We know why it's so low because of course this is related to COVID-19. But you wonder why it's at, say, at least in Canada, at 81 cents a liter, when it's actually, below zero, which is astonishing because, these oil producers are literally paying people to take this oil off of them. So it's been an enormous blow. So, we'll see how this goes. I expect Wall Street, giants like Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, that are going to buy this oil up, and and Citicorp too. They can probably, I think they estimate, basically based on what happened in 2008 and 2009, that they can turn this into a profit. I'm not so sure this time. I think the profits will eventually come back, but when they will come back isn't certain. And I think this is why you have this request for Congress to, pass, I guess, a law. I'm not sure how you guys term it, or a motion to for the U.S. government to buy the oil. But as I've already pointed out, storing it is going to be difficult because we've seen a worldwide drop of 30% down for oil. So you can see that 30% is enough to throw the entire global economy out the window.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So I imagine, so I suppose pressure on, quote unquote, getting life back to normal is only going to increase. It's going to be interesting to see what happens, in the fall. If you look at the death rate from COVID in the last 2-3 days, yesterday America had its highest at almost 3,000. That figure, by the way, of 6,000 something that they included, 3,778 was, I think, old folks. They've retracted that from Worldometer, and the initial number is back. So I'm not using these other figures, and today was, I think, nearly 2,000 as well. And we're out of flu season. So, obviously there's going to be an impact, and I think decisions are going to, have to be made about what's worse.
Yeah. Now, in light of all of this, I've been going on this theory on the show for the past few weeks, and actually over the past few months, something I've said in passing, but have actually taken more seriously given current events, that the entire oil market is a farce. Because there's so much of this stuff, it should cost virtually nothing. And it looks like the markets are now reflecting that, but that's something I've said for a while. And There's your peak oil. 20 years ago, Al Gore, all these people were, oh, peak oil, we're going to run out soon, and it's going to be a disaster. We don't have enough oil for 200 years. But we just keep on finding it everywhere, whether that be in the United States, whether that be in the Middle East, whether that be in Russia, whether that be in Europe, whether that be in East Asia. It's an abundant resource, which leads me to believe that maybe it's not as non-renewable as it was originally pitched to us. And look, let me put on my tinfoil hat here, but I think probably the non-renewable energy thing was a giant conspiracy to keep this thing valuable when they realized how much there was. I think around the 70s and the 80s they realized, wow, there's a lot of this stuff. We need to protect our profits. We need to make sure this stays propped up. Let's just tell the people that there's only so much and it's going to run out eventually. But I mean, there it is, and perhaps one of the biggest ironies is you're probably going to see the oil companies start, standing alongside Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, advocating for a ban on fracking. Wouldn't that be something? Now, I don't think it will come to that, but I mean, crazier
Oh
things have
no.
happened. Now, in terms of the response, we went over the American oil industry. We went over Saudi Arabia. Uh, I imagine you probably are, and most of our audience probably is. Now, I saw Brian McDonald. He's a Russia analyst, even though he's sort of the black sheep of the Russian analysts because he doesn't think everything's a Putinist conspiracy to dominate the world. So, yeah, he's a bit on the fringes there. You could even say he has a pro Russia bias, which I would. But he made the point that during the time in which Russia has been sanctioned, in which things haven't been too easy for them, rather than investing money in their economy, as it were, they put a lot of the oil savings, I believe most of their oil savings, in what you could call a rainy day fund. And it looks like that's starting to quite literally pay off for them. People talk about, again, they'll take any uh, minor crisis in Russia, not that this is a minor crisis, at least from my estimation, and say this is
Mhm.
the end of Russia, this is the end of Putin, this is the end of whatever. But it seems like actually having some foresight, thinking longer than 4 year election cycles or 2 year congressional election cycles, has its benefits, and uh, turns out it can actually do wonders for your nation. Now, I'm not saying Russia's out of the scot free. I'm not saying they're not in for some hard times. I'm not definitely not the Yeltsin era. I wouldn't say I wouldn't go back to that, but it looks like they have at least a little bit of a leg up on most countries when it comes to having an emergency fund in order to deal with both the downturn in one of their main economic sectors and dealing with a nationwide lockdown.
Yeah. Things. I'm not of the opinion that everyone is going to profit from this, but the U.S. Uh, I would say that things could go very badly in Russia. Um,
Maybe
should
they'll
this
finally get that
continue?
liberal democracy then, and they definitely won't radicalize further. No, that wouldn't happen. They would find another
Yeah.
Yeltsin to fix this crisis. That's what the Western media told me. I have no reason to disbelieve that narrative at all.
Well, I mean, I think the only path forward is that they have to find another way of bolstering their economy outside of oil, because the truth is, in 10 years, if something like this happens again, essentially what that means over a 50-year period, Russia's stuck in a stagnant cycle. So, they're going to need an economy that's more diversified and less dependent on oil. Now, they've been moving towards that, and not just through their rainy day fund, but by developing other industries. But they're still, woefully small in compared to oil. So, yeah, that's so. Yeah, they're definitely not out of the woods now. Early on, before the absolute crash, into the negatives, there was a fear that once the economy started to pick up and restrictions were relaxed, that oil would eventually rebound, but that but at that time that the U.S. Would run out of domestic supply. Well, that's doubtful now, because
in a sense, because of this crash, what you have is like an overabundance of oil that America then could use, that will be there and available. So this is what I mean. I mean, it's terrible in one sense, but in another sense, some of the projections that we had 2 weeks ago about what could happen with oil, sometime mid 2020 and a little bit later, well, they can go a different way, especially now because there's so much extra oil left over. And it's something that, I mean, it will add to inflation, just like the Trump bucks and everything else. But what else are you supposed to do? Are you are you just allowed, are you just going to let, I don't know, people starve? Are you going to let things turn into riot situations and, different neighborhoods fighting each other? Like, it could, I mean, if you didn't bail out, I think you could see those kind of scenarios opening up. And I don't think, America in the 19th century compared to now it's very different, right? Because in a way, there was very little that the outside world could do to determine how the American Civil War would be resolved. I think a highly destabilized America now would have other countries far more easily involve themselves, and it's definitely not within America's interest to allow things to collapse like that. And of course, America has many states that depend on it and a lot of responsibilities, and it just simply can't let that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. But you're right. We might get those scary scenarios where a bunch of guys put on some black and brown shirts. So that'd be terrible. I wonder if we've seen that before. I don't know. I think that'd be the first time anything like that has ever happened. But in all seriousness, yeah. Like I said at the beginning of this, probably the weakest position the United States has been in since the start of this new world order, as it were. I would say in the 1940s, 1945 was really the start of this order. But I mean, I think it's the weakest we've been since since before World War II. And that's not saying like we're on the brink of collapse, but if the cards play out in the right direction, if we, if our rivals play the right hands, it could very well be the collapse of the American Empire. And I don't say that lightly. I don't say that like I don't hype it like I used to. I'll put it that way. And I'm not anticipating that either. But if there was ever a time where things would be knocked back to,
Yeah.
like I said earlier, if there was ever a time when things would be knocked back to a multipolar world, it would be now. And you also make a good point with Russia, how uh, they're getting stuck in this cycle where their economy goes with the global economy, which goes with the oil prices. Now, I think compared to 2008, compared to the 1998 crisis, as you said, their economy is more diversified. It seems like they've taken measures against this, but they got caught in a transitionary period where, yeah, it could bite them very hard because of that. Now, again, I'm not anticipating the collapse of Russia. I'm really not anticipating the collapse of any nation. I'd say the closest I would go when it comes to a major global collapse, and I'm not even saying this is likely, but the most likely I think would be the European Union, which we don't have much
Yeah.
EU news this week. There is some talks with the European Central Bank, which we'll probably end up covering next week or the week
Yeah.
after with that. But yeah, I don't see this situation improving anytime soon, and I'll just leave it at this. It's a perfect time for vultures, if you will.
hmm Yeah, I mean, the other thing I forgot to mention was, besides the importance of oil vis-a-vis the petrodollar, the U.S. military is actually the largest buyer of and consumer of oil. So it heavily relies on it, and that kind of dovetails to what I was saying earlier about how all this excess oil, if basically, if the U.S. public pays for it, it would provide very cheap oil. It wouldn't be great for the oil companies at a certain rate. Of course, what you'll have is a lot of companies going out of businesses. I'm sure some of them already are in that process now. But and we're talking about the smaller companies here. But so anyhow, that is, I mean, if anything, COVID-19 could be like the beginning of a very different strategy where countries kind of accept the norm of like, I guess what I'm getting at is the new norm could also be austerity in a way that we haven't seen before, and people will have to literally like come up with more creative methods of living and surviving with more austerity.
We're all
Because
Greeks
essentially we're all Greeks, yeah. But I think this is something that's going to be the future, and that will affect everyone, including China.
Yeah,
But
not to go.
I'm assuming that China and Asia basically are actually like the best poised right now to overcome this, particularly the way they've been able to handle the virus more effectively, the way their societies, because they're less individualistic. They didn't think that like, you know, people being traced who were diagnosed with coronavirus meant like the population was going to go into FEMA camps. This is going to serve them well. They will come out better, and even a country like Australia could recover and be sort of ripe for the moment to make new deals, say with Japan, because they haven't been affected that much. I think they have like less than 100 people have passed away because of this. So
It's true what they said about
I
the
think it was
heat.
like 77 or 85, something like that. Pardon me?
I mean, it's true what they said about the heat.
Yeah. Um, so if I had to choose, like, which region would probably do better, say into 2021, I would say Asia.
Yeah, and to dispel the notion that I know a lot of people are probably thinking right now. Well, can you really trust the Chinese numbers? And look, you have every right to be skeptical of China, considering everything that's happened. But I think they're probably not too far off now. Of course, there's probably some cover up, but we've seen similar strategies employed in South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan that have all turned out the same. And they're obviously much more transparent. So I think regardless of how accurate the Chinese numbers are, you still have a point about how the Asian cultures were able to have a more uh, coherent response to this. And we've seen this to
Yeah.
a lesser degree in Eastern Europe, such as Russia and Hungary, but even then, it's still more individualistic, not that cohesive response as we saw in East Asia. But yeah, and one last point I want to make about your point was we're already seeing this. There's already some news reports on this. And I imagine it'll increase over time, especially with some economic downturns. A lot of people are becoming, I guess, say, more self-sufficient, planting their own gardens, making do with less. So we could see some bright sides out of all this, where people do become, again, more self-reliant in a way, and return to a more modest and I can't really think of a better word, old style of living as compared to the hyper-capitalist, consumerist way we had going from the late 80s until a few months ago.
Yeah, and that sort of that exemplifies very well what I meant about like austerity measures. And you'll have people who won't be able to leave their parents' home. The price of moving out will be significantly challenged.
Wow, I said we're all Greek, and it looks like that's true in more ways than one now. Yeah, but I'm at living with your parents gang, so I ain't complaining. uh, but I suppose it's time to move on to our last couple stories here. Now, Donald Trump is out there making America great again, keeping America great, and really restoring our reputation on the world stage. Because you know why? You know what? It's coming down the pipe, at least being considered.
What? Do tell.
Well, it turns out one of Trump's favorite foreign policy advisors, our ambassador to Germany, Richard Grenell, a brave gay man himself, has recommended to the administration that we should suspend intelligence sharing operations to any country that has criminalized homosexuality.
That's right.
That is right.
It's weird. It's kind of like, so the American empire is expanding and it's coming up against kind of like a wall. And this wall of countries that kind of, aren't that gay or not very gay at all, if they could be brought on board, that would be really great. That could, so yeah, I guess it's about, freeing the gays.
Yeah, why doesn't Orban respect trans weddings? Why doesn't Putin let them bake the cake? Huh? Why is he being such a bigot?
Yeah.
But in all seriousness, we've discussed these sort of things at length and how it is, again, a projection of American power. And at this point, I honestly think it's for demoralization, especially in Eastern Europe on the front against Russia, because Hungary, Poland, these countries we've discussed, they have their rough histories with Russia. Now, some of them are willing to bury the hatchet, as it were, such as Hungary, such as Bulgaria, and pursue a more cooperative relationship with Russia. Some are less inclined to do that, such as Poland and the Czech Republic and the Baltic states. But they are still a nationalistic people. Most of them are still religious to a degree. I wouldn't say they're some of the most devout countries in the world. I mean, Czech Republic definitely isn't, but a lot of these countries still have a sense of religion, and especially in their culture. And again, come from an older worldview, as it were. So I'm not saying that automatically means sympathies to Russia, but it does open at least a little bit of a door, even if it just leaves it a little bit cracked open. There's enough where the Russians could get their foot in the door in terms of a cultural sense. Honestly, I think it's purely for demoralization purposes. Now, this, of course, refers to countries that have actually criminalized homosexuality. Now, I doubt the same treatment will be applied to Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. Of course not.
Right.
We need to be culturally sensitive when it comes to the Arab Islamic Gulf states. But I honestly haven't pegged down this policy, even though it's been there for a year. Because the only success it has so far is homosexuality is legal in Botswana now, and it hasn't really targeted Eastern Europe. They've done that in more subtle ways. I think Ukraine has actually come under a bit of scrutiny, but it seems like Africa is the big place where they're really targeting this. Now, you could make the same argument that, yeah, it is for moral degradation in Africa. That there are interests that the United States has in Africa, China has in Africa, France has in Africa. So you could say it is trying to put the liberal empire's foothold in that part of the world, but I don't know. I have a feeling that in a roundabout way, especially with the way policy is applied, maybe not specific policy, but American foreign policy in general, where these pride parades pop up, where these things pop up, I think it's targeted toward Eastern Europe, if anything.
Yeah, I think it's a signal. Basically, it's a signal. I think it has. It's for two things simultaneously. It's one for African nations that are not on board. It's kind of like a warning to them. We don't have a reason to exploit or tear you away from China for your resources. But, this gay stuff in the West is super serious. And all I have to do is tell them that you're mean to gays, and that's it. They will permit me to bomb the hell out of you. So, I think that's one signal, and the other one is basically is to tell Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, these other countries cool it. I don't mind you being nationalistic against Russia, but cool it with anti-gay rhetoric, or I don't know, cool it with the anti-Semitic remarks. Because the two are kind of inextricable right now in, I guess, Western ideology, late stage neoliberal Western ideology. So only because I can't imagine, a state, that like would treat Jews badly but have gay pride parades. They seem inexorable to me.
Well, clearly Jeremy Corbyn's UK would.
Yes. It's a Nazgul position,
Oh no.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, I think that's essentially the point of it. It's kind of like a kind of a saber rattling that America is doing like once a year now. I don't know. Are they doing this because a lot of gay pride parades are being canceled? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it does have to do with a lot of it has to do with a domestic appeal, saying, "Look, us Republicans, we really care about gay rights. We criticize the way they treat sexual minorities in the third world, aren't we? So much more progressive than those. Democrats are the real homophobe. Is I think that's part of it. Then it goes down to the demoralization, sort of a projection of imperial power. How you said pride parades are the new occupation force. It sort of signifies that rather than marching troops down the street. You march grown men in tutus and doing all sorts of depraved things down the street of every major city at least once a year. But this does spark a question in me, because this is something I've been considering for a while. If the American empire took a more, at least veneer of conservatism, for example, someone like a Reagan, or if it was that sort of system where Americans are viewed as very patriotic, very right-wing, red-blooded, and they wanted to support fellow Western patriots against those evil Easterners or whatever, and put sort of the neoliberal empire in a veil of faux 1950s conservatism, do you think it'd be more successful than this outright rainbow imperialism? I don't know. Which system do you think would actually do them better in the long run? Are they both equally, I wouldn't say doomed to fail, but equally have their flaws?
Well, I mean, I think the whole point of it, I mean, I don't know. It could be that maybe gay couples want to travel to some of these countries.
Tourism dollars.
They're just trying to make it safe. I don't, like I've said it before, I think, one of the reasons I think the West glorifies gay culture.
Returning to our Greek roots.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, third time's the Greek.
I think it's because I think because the economy is a highly atomized and individualistically based economy. I think, they look at how much spending power gays have, and they have tremendous spending power, and they want I mean, technically, I don't think they really care whether you're gay or not. I think they want you to be unmarried and, not really be budget conscious, or, just basically have a lot of disposable cash, because it's a service-based economy. The manufacturing is happening elsewhere. Now, it's going to be very interesting after COVID to see what happens next and where it goes, because there's a lot of populations right now in the West that are expecting some kind of return of manufacturing to occur. And as the U.S. election will hopefully start ramping up, I would expect to hear that kind of rhetoric. At the very least, the justifications for it are very strong, no less with, for instance, bringing up scientific research, biological research, and pharmaceutical factories. So, especially pharmaceutical factories. So I would imagine, and of course the supply chain that was affected because of COVID, some amount of extra self-reliance at the cost of
higher prices would be something that I think most Westerners would take right now. If that means that they can more effectively deal with whenever the next outbreak happens, and that it's a shorter period of time, and you have less businesses going out of business and less individuals losing their jobs, then I think most people would be willing to pay the higher prices. So I think the economy up until now, and I think so. This is why I think single women and gay men are so revered in the West, is because the idea of having limitless, appetite to buy stuff, to buy next product, and just not to really think about for the future, because guess what? You're probably never going to have enough money to buy a house.
Yeah. It's fun.
So,
It's funny that you brought all this up, because I saw something a while ago. It was from actually a more lefty take, but not necessarily a lefty that's really obsessed with social issues, sort of like the old style left, really focused on economics, pretty much saying that capitalists have no ideology beyond what will make them the most money. They'll support gay pride in the West in the United States, but support death squads in Latin America so long as there's a paycheck at the end of the day.
Right, and part of the American economy really started to change in the late 70s. I forget his name now, but he had Reagan had an advisor that basically mapped out where the American economy would shift. And one of the things that he developed was, by the way, this is what I'm referring to is The Century of the Self, which I highly recommend people watch that documentary. It's still timely today. You really do see the development of late stage empire taking hold. And so, but just to get back to the theory, so his theory was that you have to create a different consumer identity. So the consumer identity prior was, you're a guy, you're married, you have 2 or 3 kids, you have a mortgage, you have a car. You have to think about what you're going to store away for the future for your kids. That next repair on your house, can you really afford where you live? Do you want to buy a second? It was big purchases, lifetime purchases. You needed, even the car had to be fairly reliable, because this is how people mapped out their lives, right? And so what this economist was suggesting to Reagan, this is just before he got elected, was that the economy can only keep growing with a higher rate of disposability, more offshoring of industry into China, and more disposable cash. And so this identity had to be, so that same guy that was, wondering about how to take care of his family, I kid you not, now was, you really like cycling. What have you bought for yourself? Wouldn't this Italian racing bike be so awesome? You would get in shape. So this kind of individualistically minded idea was, so you would have smaller purchases happening more frequently, right? With less clearance and overhead, which was probably the wife and, considerations for the family and for the welfare of the kids. So, and things have moved gradually that way. You notice how it got cheaper and cheaper to actually manufacture stuff, but nobody's lives really improved. The savings didn't increase, and most people live more paycheck to paycheck now than they lived 40 to 50 years ago. So I think that's one of the reasons why they really push this stuff. The other is, there was a cultural, revolution that happened in the States, and people literally went mad all over the West. And you could argue that the cart comes before the horse, and that the culture determined this, and that basically what you had were these old fogies that were catching up as to how they could make more profit because society had changed. And so I think it's both of them. I do think that there is a liberal class that really does believe
Every country must change its entire history, its idea of itself for sexual minorities.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And again, when it comes to like global capitalism, they adopt whatever strategy is expedient at the time, and it just so happens that the LGBTQCIA is the expedient option at the time. Now, there's one, maybe two topics I want to close the show out with, so I'll start with the bigger one, just in case we can't get to the other one. Uh, Kim Jong Un. There's been some news about his health. Now, U.S. sources have disputed that he's dead or in a coma or anything, but a couple of nights ago he was in a surgery, and there are reports that he was in grave health. Now, like I said, it's all up in the air. This isn't unnormal for him to not show up in the public eye for weeks, if not months at a time. There was something like this in 2015 that happened, but it ultimately he'll almost always show up. So there's that. I don't personally think he's dead, but it does raise an interesting question if he is dead or incapacitated on what is the future of North Korea. Now, before all this broke out, one of the main focuses in East Asia was the Korean peace talks, which came to a stall at least between the U.S. and North Korea. There were some talks between the U.S. Between South Korea and North Korea. The military drill has been suspended for a while now, and I think especially given current events, it will remain suspended regardless of any tension. North Korea hasn't really acted up lately, but my original speculation, let's just go on the premise that maybe he is dead. And I think which one of his mad dog uncles are going to take power, because a lot of his regime is based on what his father did, whether that be his uncles or his father's generals. They have a large degree of control of their country. Now, there had been purges. You probably heard the story of the couple. The one that was executed via artillery fire, and the other one that was quite literally fed to dogs. So there were purges under him, but rather low-level purges. But it seems like the name being tossed around is his sister. Now, his sister, you'll recall a couple years back when they had the Winter Olympics in South Korea, was sort of the
Right.
North Korean representative there. And young woman, I guess you could say like attractive face. Like again, it's a young Asian woman leading a totalitarian regime. It's all very odd. Let's her name is Kim Yo Jong. That's what it is. I mean, ultimately, it would be the same case where a lot of Kim Jong Il's and by extension Kim Il Sung's regime would be in place in the military and intelligence and in like the inner circle of it with just a new figurehead. Not that the supreme leader of North Korea is powerless, but especially with how young, especially just both of them are. Yeah, there's people who've been around for decades ruling this country that are sort of a guiding hand. And honestly, I think if Kim Jong Un is dead, it could lead to a bit of a power struggle because you're like I said, there were some purges. He was sort of cleaning house. It seems like he hasn't done that in a while. His sister was actually somebody he brought in new as sort of head of propaganda ministry, and that seems like that's groomed as the successor. But I imagine some of the old guard probably doesn't like this restructuring of power, if you will. And like I said, let's assume he's dead or unable to return to power because of health reasons, or effectively just like a vegetable. I think North Korea could tear itself apart in that case. Now, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's still a volatile situation if worse does come to worse. And I'm not saying like it'd be such a tragedy if this dear supreme leader died, but I think regardless of all of North Korea's faults, especially with the little bit of diplomacy there's been, Kim Jong Un, despite everything he has done or probably done, is a bit of a stabilizing force.
Yeah, I would agree. Of course, according to some in Korea, he's not ever going to die.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I don't
This is
know if
all
you know
just
about this.
Western imperialist dog propaganda. Our supreme leader is eternal.
Yeah, so I've heard that. Uh, you know, I can't really imagine that after Kim Jong Il and then Kim Jong Un dies, that somehow South Korea will dramatically change. I think there's something else going on there that's not just, communism. I think there's something more substantive that's happening there. I'm not saying it never will. I just don't see this as the catalyst for it. Um, yeah,
Yeah, I'm not saying like that this would be the collapse of North Korea, but I think things could get dangerous, especially if one of his more hawkish uncles does come to power over
yeah,
his sister or whoever else would be in the inner circle. Like it would be sort of like on, of course, on a much smaller scale, like when Stalin died and didn't really have a clear successor, and everyone was thinking, what's going to happen to the Soviet Union? Who's going to take power? Now, like I said, North Korea is no Soviet Union, but it would create a lot of instability, and it would put things even more on edge than they already are in a region like East Asia with everything going on now. It's probably one of the worst times something like this could happen.
yeah, yeah. I hear you. It would have a dramatic effect, like no doubt.
Now,
Um, but I just think like after, but who knows? Maybe just the quick succession of like one leader dying and then like really less than 10 years later, like his son dying, like with I can see how that would mean like a loss of confidence.
yeah,
It's just that I feel like the culture, like whatever is developing there is just too huge. It's almost like everybody has guessed it wrong.
yeah, and like you said, especially with a culture like that whose entire country is based on the idea that this family is made up of godlike figures who are the only people fit to rule this nation, even more so than even like the traditional monarchies or even like the ancient monarchies with like the god kings of Egypt. I would say it's probably on par with that. Maybe not the best comparison, but the first thing that comes to my head. Yeah, it could create that, and I'm of two minds about this because if he is actually dead, they're probably going to pull what they did like thousands of years ago in China, where when the first emperor died, they waited like a month to tell the people that he actually died and announce a successor, and they kept up the illusion. Oh, he's definitely alive. He just hasn't shown up in public for a while. And if that is the case, or if he is like brain dead or in a coma, and they could probably do that, especially with the absolute iron grasp they have on the media there. But I do have a feeling if it does get to like a critical mass and he is fine, he's going to show up eventually. Or there could be some harebrained strategic reason and like trying to fool the world into thinking he's dead or incapacitated and then showing up at the right time. Uh, Weird diplomatic games like this happen all the
Head
time,
fake.
and it would be very characteristic of North Korea to pull a stunt like this.
Yeah, I see them being able to pull something off like this for sure. Um, if he does turn out dead, then you have to ask yourself, CIA reset. I just remembered that in the early days of COVID in February, was watching the Weekly Sweat, and this guy kept typing CIA reset. So, uh,
More like
but
Hoof
yeah,
Jong Un. But zero cases in North Korea. Okay, I believe their official numbers like more than anyone. Honestly, I do because they probably shoot anyone with symptoms of it. Like, yeah. Look, I don't think Dear Leader pulls any punches. Is what I'm getting at. Now, we're pushing the hour and a half mark, but there is one last topic I want to go on to, and this isn't really a foreign policy topic, but I think it is worth mentioning because it really shows the power dynamics in the United States and how Democrats rule versus how Republicans rule. Now, a couple days ago, of course, Trump issued the executive order on we're going to suspend any immigration into the United States, and then immediately came out the other day and said, well, oh, there's going to be exceptions for this, and this, HB1 and migrant workers. And then eventually it got to the point where the executive order would be nothing more than a piece of paper that was unenforceable. And we've been over this. There's been so many opportunities where Trump could enforce his 2016 promises and be the sort of the candidate he presented himself on the campaign trail, but he has yet to seize it. Now, I think the difference between Democrats and Republicans and the right and the left in this country, it does go back to sort of the inner party, outer party dynamics where, again, Democrats the inner party, Republicans the outer party, where if there was a Democrat in office, so Obama was still in office, the Clintons were in office, they would be using a time like this to pass sweeping reforms to implement their agendas, things they either promised or had intention of doing, whether that be more something nefarious. Like, for example, I could see if a Democrat was in office, they would be pushing hard for gun control. We've seen Democratic governors and mayors try to do that already. But you have Republicans in office, and rather than trying to implement anything that would further their agenda, now the closest thing I've gotten, which I of course support, is there has been some forced shutdown of abortion clinics because they're considered non-essential. But I can tell you, if a Democrat was in office, they would be using this for sweeping power. When the Republicans, they got one thing done, and Trump can't touch immigration without it becoming a backlash. And the reason I mention this is because I think it shows, again, that power dynamic where Democrats are just willing to do it, go against the grain. They don't care. Whereas Republicans, they have to pussyfoot around everything. And when the perfect storm presents themselves, never let a crisis go to waste. I can't remember who said that, but point being is, Democrats live by that philosophy, while Republicans not only don't live by it, but refuse to live by it.
Yeah, because ultimately they're afraid of wielding power. They're just never willing to take it or to go for it, and that's how they just keep losing.
I mean, quite literally the definition of controlled opposition. I honestly don't know any other way I would term that, but yeah, and it is frustrating for someone who is, I guess, technically a Republican to see this. And I think we've been over this in the show before, how we talked about, look at all these things Trump could do, but doesn't, and instead uses this as an opportunity to say, haha, look at those dumb Democrats. Like, yeah, that's the most you're ever going to get out of the Republican Party. It's just frustrating, and yeah, like I said, I don't know any other way to put it than they pussyfoot around, and yeah.
I guess it creates the illusion, like you can create the illusion of having power by playing by the rules, because ultimately the rules in the Constitution is where the power resides, and those who play by it, it's like, well, I mean, you've literally lost everything.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, this doesn't apply to when they want to drop more bombs on Iraq or Syria, or want to lessen regulations for some multinational corporation, or get Jeff Bezos out of paying his taxes. But when it comes to shutting down immigration or something like that, ooh, we're going to have to play by the rules. We're going to have to go through the courts. We're going to have to hear what they have to say about it. It's going to be a bit of a process. It's an uphill battle. But, that other stuff, that sort of the bipartisan support issues, no problem at all. They can do that completely under the table, expand the surveillance state, expand any of this. Yeah, A-okay. Yeah, but when it comes to issues they campaign on, that's a different story. But that's all I had for this week.
Yeah, it's been quite a week, but I don't have anything more to add.
Yeah, except it's only going to get crazier. I keep my eye on the oil, especially. We'll see how that turns out, and that could open the door for all kinds of crises in the coming months. And out of everything, I think the oil crisis will probably have a more long-term impact than the virus, as it were. Now, not that the two aren't interconnected, but I have a feeling we're going to be dealing with this oil crisis and the fallout from that much longer than we're going to be dealing with the virus. That's all I got to say for this.
Yeah, I would agree.
But I think that's a wrap. So we'll see everyone next time, and goodbye.
Take care, guys.